Our next speaker is Dr. Clay Johnston. Dr. Johnston is the Dean of the Dell Medical School at UT Austin. He was the winner of the 2008 William Feinberg Award, and he is going to be speaking on Padding the Pacific, pace of translation in stroke research.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. So yes, I am not Patty Hearn, and I am sorry for that. She's a fabulous speaker doing great stuff, but she was not able to be here at the last minute, and so I'm thrilled to be a part of this. Can you all reset the timer just so I know when to? So I'm doing this to be provocative, and I'm hoping that we can all work together to change what I see as the major problem in the field right now. The Polynesians explored the entire Pacific Ocean, and they were in initially the more southern islands in the Pacific. And when famine hit, when their overcrowding was a problem, they'd send out boats. And those boats, they would navigate based on birds and the wind and the waves, and make their way to new islands, crossing thousands of miles in many cases. Most of those boats didn't make it. A horrible thing, right? The technologies that they were relying on were really awkward, imperfect, lots of life lost, a lot of slow progress during that time. So I went back through my old slides. This is a great thing about keeping your files forever. So I went back to 2000, and I found the presentation that I gave on the sort of first major paper that I had, which was on the stroke risk after TIA. And you can see the font thing that we were using at the time. It is just kind of funny to see it. That paper it came out in JAMA, and I presented it at this conference at the same time. And we found that after TIA, the stroke risk was really high, so 10.5% at 90 days. And in the conclusion in that talk, I said additional studies are required to define effective management strategies after recent TIA. So no surprise, right? High risk, let's figure out what's going to work. So at the same time, we had been working on a trial. And we thought, gosh, we got to find more aggressive therapies for thrombosis after TIA. I mean, it's so obvious. So what at the time made sense? Well, we thought clopidogrel and aspirin versus aspirin was a logical choice for testing in this setting. So that was actually 1999 when we wrote that first grant. So where are we today? Well, that's the POINT trial, right? That was also the CHANCE trial, and there were trials in between. And we're still 2 years away from answering that question. So it's going to take us 19 years to answer a question, an obvious question, an important question that we posed in 2000. I mean, that's just completely intolerable, right? Why would we ever allow a simple question like that to go unanswered for almost 20 years? We have pieces of that answer, but we do not have a definitive answer at this point. At that same meeting, I presented some observational data on unruptured aneurysms and whether coiling was safer than clipping. And we had some pretty compelling observational data to suggest that coiling was safer. At the time, the vast majority of unruptured aneurysms, this is for treatment of unruptured aneurysms, vast majority of them were treated with clipping. So since that time, there has not been a randomized trial of coiling versus clipping. We still have now a bunch of patients who are treated with clipping, and it's not as though we're picking the right candidates for coiling and clipping, because at some institutions, the vast majority are clipped, and at some institutions, the vast majority are coiled. And that can't be that we're selecting patients that they happen to be going to the right places. So again, 20 years ago, important data, you could argue that they weren't important. They certainly didn't change practice, but they should have at least led to asking a very, very critical question about which of these two technologies, quite different, was more effective for a common condition, unruptured aneurysms, and yet we still have not done the randomized trial to address this problem. So back to the paddling the Pacific. In essence, we have a problem not too different from the Polynesians in the way we're approaching the research that we do today. So we have a whole bunch of folks writing grants, so canoes setting out from Tahiti. Of those grants, a small fraction actually get funded. So, you know, what is it today? I heard the funding line somewhere around 11%, which is good. It was down around 9% previously. So each grant is a ton of work and takes a lot of time, right? So each grant is probably a year of preparation and putting it together, and then another year before you get a final decision on that grant. So there's 2 years, and most of those, you know, 9 out of 10 are not going to get funded. Tremendous amount of work, tremendous delay. And then, of course, the grants need to get done, the work needs to get done, so figure average 5 years. And most of those don't, well, actually, when we looked at this for major grants at NINDS, at least for the clinical trial side, most did result in important results. It was about 60% of them had results that were important, that advanced the field in some way. And then only a tiny fraction, and I'm not sure why it's not on the slide, but it says improves health. So there's basically one canoe that I'm showing in this that makes it to Hawaii and improves health. The cycles, if you just look at sort of drug development, where are we on those cycles? From the point at which you do your first translational study to evaluate whether a drug could work in humans to it actually being introduced in practice, the typical cycle for that is 15 to 17 years. 15 to 17 years. So you know, that's, how can we tolerate that kind of delay, that kind of slow innovation cycle with that much attrition? As over time, this has had major consequences, not just in terms of the time it takes for things to happen, but in terms of their total cost. So if you take the cost of building a pyramid and you bring that to net present value, it's about $3 billion would cost to build a pyramid. And that's about what it costs today to develop a new drug, $3 billion. How many new drugs can you test when it costs $3 billion to develop a drug? And then this is for questions that we know we should ask, but because it's so difficult to study things, we leave a lot of things unstudied. So this is a question for you all, and I understand everybody knows how to work the system. So it's a simple question. What proportion of the major clinical decisions you make are based on real evidence? Uh-oh. We'll let these guys work on it over there. So while you're putting your answers in, there's no right answer to this. No one knows the answer to this question. But think about a typical order set for stroke and the elements on that. And think for a minute about each of those and whether you have data for them. Most of those are things that we don't actually have answers for. Okay, O2, yes or no? Do you put a couple liters of oxygen on someone? Bed rest, right? Is that really useful? The head of bed, hey, we got data on that, right? At this conference about head of bed. Oops, can you go to the results? How do you do vital signs and neurochecks at night? Those are all like, you know, maybe we don't need trials for all those things, but wouldn't it be nice to actually have some evidence to say, and I bet we'd all do these things a little differently. All right, while they're working on it, I'll make the point. I don't know what your answers are. We'll find out in a second. But the reality is, even if you just look at guidelines, over 54% of guidelines overall are supported by opinion alone. So that means the vast majority of guideline recommendations don't have evidence for them. So, good, let's see if it fills it up. Hole is locked. Oh. It's not going to work. Well, you guys, do you know what the answers are? All right, well, that's okay. We'll find out later what you said. So probably the answer is, maybe it's 10% of what we do, maybe it's 20, it's not 50%. Most of what we do on a daily basis, important clinical decisions, are not supported by any sort of evidence. We have ideas about it. We don't need to do trials on everything, right? Some things are obvious, but we should at least have some good observational data on everything we do. And it wouldn't be so hard to collect that. So in essence, we're at sea. We're navigating without much direction in the vast majority of clinical decisions that we make today, even though we could be learning so much from what it is that we're doing, the decisions we're making. And that has also major implications in terms of overall pace of progress. And it's a shame this isn't readable, it's getting all washed out. But this shows life expectancy since 1970 and how it's changed as a function of health expenditures. And you can see the countries, you can read their names anyway, they've all had improvements in life expectancies, and health expenditures have gone up. For the US, where we spend the most by far, the change in life expectancy is actually the least amongst these countries, and they weren't carefully selected to make that the case. So in spite of all the spending that we do on R&D and on care, we spend a ton of money on care, we're not using that spending to advance our knowledge and to improve outcomes for our patients. So we're leaving all that potential useful information on the table and not addressing fundamental questions. So why is this? Well, one of the problems is that we talk about care, we think about care and we think about research, and we put a wall between the two. This is care, okay? So now I'm caring for a patient. I don't have to worry so much about consent, and the healthcare system pays for it. In the US, a $3 trillion system. And then, this is research. In the care side, I don't really collect very useful information about outcomes of my patients. It doesn't really matter. I get paid for the visit, not for their outcomes. And then research, I care about outcomes. I consent the patient. There's only a tiny sliver of resources that are invested in the research side, and I have to go through a granting process through the government in order to get access to those resources. Consenting is a hassle, administratively it's a hassle, I get paid extra to do it, right? That's the dichotomy we've created. And in reality, we need to take away these barriers and really bring care and research together. So one example is the whole notion of consent. Why is it that we're so careful about consent and research? And I think we should be. We need to make sure our patients understand. And yet, when we randomly or with bias select a patient for them outside of research, we don't consent them appropriately. Hey, I don't really know whether we should be using this drug or that drug, and I'm going to choose this one because it seems like a reasonable choice for you, and it may have these consequences. We don't do that kind of consent, and we don't normally document it. In the one instance, doing it as a research study, you have the potential to impact that patient and future patients. You can do much more good for society. In the one where you pretend not to have made a random decision, you've done an injustice to the patient by not acknowledging that you didn't know the answer, and you've done an injustice to that patient and future patients by not actually addressing the underlying uncertainty on a systematic basis to find an answer to that question. So which is more ethical? I'd say consenting for all the things that we don't know and collecting that data and being open to randomization. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So we got to bring these two concepts together. I'd also say too that it does not make sense that we spend so much money on clinical care and yet don't even begin to research and study what happens in that clinical care. That just doesn't make sense. There's no other industry that spends that little on R&D for the industry. We spend a tiny fraction, even though NIH budget is wonderful, the actual amount of work that we need to do in healthcare delivery is neglected compared to the auto industry or media or tech or any other area. We've got to start to think about rapid cycle innovation. 15 to 17 years is not rapid cycle innovation. Every other end, imagine if cars worked that way, or iPhones. We'd still be using, the Palm Pilot. And we would, before getting to the iPhone 6, it'd be our great-grandchildren would have access to the iPhone 6, right? So, we don't tolerate those kinds of cycles of innovation, and yet we do in healthcare all the time. We need to think about each of these steps and where we can make a difference. We spend a lot of energy on administrative tasks related to research. We don't actually collect currently. We collect it more and more better data. And I would say outcomes for good clinical work should be the same as outcomes for research, right? It should be that we're tracking those outcomes consistently, whether we're caring for a patient or doing research. They're the same things that matter, right? All of that is doable today, and we need to invest more to get it done right. There are some evidence, there's some places out there where we've made substantial progress and where I think there's great opportunity. So one is, with NINDS, thinking about clinical trials in stroke, we've seen an evolution in these networks. And I think that's been wonderful to see. That's an example of an innovation that's been useful. So we went from the CRC, the Clinical Research Collaboration, which was an early version of a network for stroke, to the NET, which has been quite useful in accelerating trials, now to StrokeNet. But there are places out there, where they're testing clinical trials, and these are harder for acute studies, but easier for non-acute. They're done entirely on the internet. So enroll the patients on the internet, collect their clinical data, send a nurse out to their home, send the drug out to their home, do all the follow-up and everything there. And then you can use telemedicine to screen patients, you can use telemedicine for follow-up, and get a national or even international trial done with basically a single hub, a single site. And there are variants of that are being tested all over. We need more examples of that in the stroke world. Pragmatic clinical trials is another major area that we need to be thinking about. We're seeing more and more of those. They can be even more pragmatic. And we can even start to think about how we acknowledge that randomization occurs on a daily basis in our actual practices. Observational research will help us, help to guide what we know, what we don't know, help to create those questions, but ultimately we're going to have to come back to randomization. Now there's going to be a point in the future where artificial intelligence provides a greater tool for us in the actual care of patients. And I think it'll be interesting to see how we interface with that and to think about a future in which that same platform could be used to really bridge research and clinical care. So there may be a time when all the clinical data for a patient is present in the cloud, and that I could ask a question like this. Siri, Mrs. Peterson has just had a minor stroke, and she had that stroke while taking 80 milligrams of aspirin. What do you recommend?
There is no solid evidence to recommend increasing aspirin dose or starting clopidogrel. I would recommend aspirin 325 milligrams, and then we can compare outcomes to others with a similar situation.
All right, I don't know if you could understand her. She is kind of hard to understand. But basically, she made a recommendation. She said, there's no difference between, you could use 325 of aspirin or you could use clopidogrel. There's no evidence. So why don't you use aspirin? What she did was randomize that patient, right? And why not, if there's no difference between the two? And then now she knows that patient was randomized. I can make a difference. I can make a decision not to go with her recommendation, but she just created a randomization code by which, as long as it's followed more than it's not followed, then that creates a cascade that allows for us to actually have a randomized patient pretty ethically, right? There's an equivalence in those decisions. Let's not argue about the specific case here, but there are plenty of scenarios where that would be ethical, and then one could track those outcomes. So I think I'm encouraging all of us not to be stuck in the system that we have. The system we have is a century from now going to look like we were a bunch of Luddites. And we are the ones who need to push forward better systems that allow us a much more rapid way to translate discoveries into future therapies. Thank you very much.